Aboro, Aboye, Abosheshe, Ekabo, and welcome to the Ifagbemiro show. I am your host, and I will be taking you through this 1-hour program. Tonight, or today, depending on when you're viewing, our very first discussion today is going to be on the early history of the Orisa community of Trinidad and Tobago. I would be using several sources from which I would be reading some extracts, and then I would be discussing the details of some of the information that I would be presenting. I would also be using some sources from some very old books that has information concerning the practices of African tradition in Trinidad and Tobago. All right, the first document that I would like to make reference to is a document that is called Reflections of the Children of Sango, which basically is an essay on a history of Orisa worship in Trinidad. This particular chapter in the book is titled Sango the Ide, right? And this gives the history of the establishing of the community in Trinidad between the years 1839 and 1869. So I would now read a fragment and then I would discuss it a little bit. The belated British efforts to suppress the slave trade after the 1807 withdrawal provided the numbers to recreate successfully a Yoruba cultural community in Trinidad with sufficient vibrancy to facilitate the transposition of the religious practice that eventually would be called Sango. The establishment of a community or communities of Orisa worshippers in Trinidad must be dated by the arrival of Africans liberated from slave ships operating after 1807, and the bulk of who came after emancipation. They came to Trinidad sometime via the Mixed Anti-Slave Trade Commission in Cuba and Brazil, but more so from the liberated African yards in St. Helena and Sierra Leone. British West Indian planters used their imperial connections to have approximately 36,000 Africans transported to the Caribbean. Trinidad planters received about 10,000 between 1834 and 1869. Between 1841 and 1864, approximately 8,385 liberated slaves and other Africans arrived in Trinidad. 3,510 from Sierra Leone and the Crucos, 3,000 996 from St. Helena, and 879 from Rio and Havana. The recaptives included the Yoruba, who were now victims of the trade in larger numbers than before. Large numbers of Congo and others from a variety of ethnicities, which later on we would go into the breakdown of all the different groups. All right, to continue reading. The port of origin determined the possibility for Yoruba on board. Those ships that came from St. Helena were most likely to have a large component of West Central Africans, given St. Helena's proximity to the West Central African enslaving area. When in some areas in the late 1840s, Jamaica and British Guyana were delinquent in their financial support for the scheme, all Africans landed at St. Helena were for some time sent exclusively to Trinidad, and a considerable number of those landed at Sierra Leone have been dispensed among some of the smaller islands. The recaptives at Sierra Leone tended to be dominated by the Yoruba because of a geographic proximity of the depot in Sierra Leone to the trading part of the slavers profiting from the conflict in Yoruba land. Many of the ships coming from Sierra Leone tended to have large concentrations of Yoruba or Aku or Eku or any of the other identifiers that were used to refer to Yoruba speakers. So that, for example, in 1844, of the 178 Africans on the Senator, 20% were listed as Yoruba. And when the Persians arrived in Trinidad, 211 Africans on June 6th in 1848, all but 3 were listed as Yoruba, captured from the Brazilian slave ship Dos Amigos. Although some of the recaptives had little choice over their Caribbean destination, Trinidad seemed to have developed a reputation in Sierra Leone among the recaptives as a favorable colony, if only for temporary settlement. In 1843, some of the liberated Africans who had acted as delegates to examine prospects for potential settlers were encouraging their compatriots to opt for Trinidad rather than Jamaica. Havana Thomas, one of the delegates, made the most favorable representations of the treatment of people in Jamaica, and she left on the chieftain for Trinidad. In addition, 4 other delegates were reported as either being speaking against the country of Jamaica or been induced to take their friends to the Trinidad party. Ethnic networks, especially among the Yorubas, were significantly represented in the population of Sierra Leone, may have influenced this recruitment. If this is correct, then the Yoruba speakers came with an already clearly formed corporate identity or open to the emergence of an ethnic identity, which Orisa worship played a significant role. Okay, but from what I've read so far, what we've discovered, even though the document speaks of various parts of West Africa and Central Africa, it would seem that Trinidad would have been one of the most favored destinations that many of these Africans, Yoruba-speaking Africans, would have opted to come to. All of the prospectors who were free people who were traveling back and forward did, in fact, give very good reports to most of the people who intended to migrate from their country to come to the Americas. All right, I would now read another part continuing on this document that sort of explains some of the things that was actually taking place in among the Yoruba tribes at the time when there was this massive migration to the Americas. The Yoruba arriving at this historical juncture in their own cultural and political development were in a favorable position to dominate and shape the cultural landscape of the post-slavery frontier society. They did so in many cultural areas, but especially in religion and popular entertainment, which made Trinidad in many ways a Yoruba cultural frontier. These largely involuntary immigrants came from areas in which the central authority at oil had collapsed in the midst of a civil war. They also left their homeland during a period when the traditional religious culture was responding to increasing incursions of Islam from the north and an expanding and aggressive frontier of Christianity from the south. It ushered in what they themselves saw and experienced as an age of confusion. It was during this period that the Yoruba, in the face of these challenges, redefined notions of community and responded to the need to define Yoruba identity. These developments in the homeland were mirrored in some way in the diaspora, where displaced Yoruba speakers found themselves in the 19th century. Both language and religion played crucial roles in the definition of Yoruba ethnicity, both at home and in the diaspora. These Yoruba, or those Yoruba who came in the 19th century post-emancipation Trinidad, found themselves in a frontier society with an open or fluid cultural landscape. Newly arrived but politically dominant English still faced challenges for cultural dominance from the historically older Spanish and numerically dominant French elements. The heterogeneous and numerically small slave population of the short-lived slave society did not bequeath a sufficient cohesive religious culture to which subaltern newcomers were forced to assimilate. The simultaneous arrival of thousands of immigrants from the Indian subcontinent as new cultural actors increased the participants involved in the process to shape the cultural landscape. All immigrant groups were in the process of fashioning an ethnic identity for the Yoruba insofar as it was expressed in religious ideology and practice. This redefinition and representation of the group identity involved intra-Yoruba homogenization, the retention and conservation of some practices where circumstances facilitated this process, the loss and erosion or deliberate suppression of some features borrowing from the available non-Yoruba practices, and the imaginative and creative construction of new practices. All of these historical processes are reflected in the contemporary bundle of practices that in Trinidad previously has been called Sango and are now labeled Orisa. All right? So much of what I've just read simply underscores or it sort of emphasizes the fact that among the immigrants who came to Trinidad from West Africa, among the Yoruba people, there would have been a great amount of them coming from Oyo. And it is known that Oyo had a reputation of being the place where the Shango cult evolved and developed. I believe it was the third or fourth Alafin of Oyo who was referred to as Shango. And of course, there are myths and stories associated to, what occurred with Shango. All right, this is why he's referred to as Obakuso. But I'm doing history today, so I wouldn't go too much into the mythological aspect of that. But I would read further on in the document. But basically, in a nutshell, what was taking place that was mentioned is the fact that there was the influence of Islam and Christianity coming into Africa at the time. And there was also a civil war that was taking place. And the central government of the Kingdom of Oyo was basically destroyed at that time. And during that time, many of the people would have heard that there were great opportunities in the Americas. Hence, you had that massive migration taking place with a combination of all these different factors. Now, I would think with all the migratory patterns that the largest groups of people who migrated from the Yoruba-speaking people in West Africa, the people of Oyo would have probably made up the greater part of the immigrant population on the island of Trinidad. Okay, the document now is going to emphasize on some of what I just spoke. The prominence of Sango, not only in the annual Ever, but also as the popular name of the religion in Trinidad, may have been an attempt to provide the kind of unifying symbol for the original heterogeneous Yoruba population. In Yoruba land, the Orisa Sango was used by the rulers of Oyo to consolidate imperial rule and serve as a mechanism of cultural integration in the empire. In a strange land, a new environment, the various sub-ethnic Yoruba groups may have sought to transcend intra-religious animosities and rivalries by emphasizing the common symbol of Sango. The preeminence of Sango may have also been the result of the numerical dominance of the arrivals from Oyo, which I mentioned earlier, or people from the areas where Sango was already the preeminent deity in the pantheon. For a decentralized religious practice that depended on the existence of strong families and fairly autonomous communities, the conditions of the 19th century Trinidad were not completely favorable to its transposition in its entirety. The cohorts of liberated Africans from which the Yoruba arrived were drawn was made biased in its composition and had a significantly high proportion of independent children. These demographic features had an important impact on the tradition of Orisa worship. The large numbers of children meant that a significant percentage of the Yoruba community had limited knowledge or experience of the religious tradition and practices. Unless those independent children were placed in homes or communities with fellow ethnics, they were the most vulnerable to the possibility of cultural loss and change. J.D.Y. Peel has argued that in the 19th century, by far the most important factor affecting the involvement in Orisa cults was gender. The great bulk of active and regular worshippers were women, although Yoruba women in the 19th century were noted for their independence and a reported aversion to marriage, with many remaining single female heads of household. Those who sought male partners and cohabitants were restricted in their choices and had to rely on non-Yoruba males. The religious socialization of the offspring of these intra-African unions, if the father was a resident head of household, depended on the political dynamics of the domestic relationship. The male bias in the community also meant that the possibility of endogamous family formations was limited, and as a result, the transmission of religion through family lines was affected. Over time, recruitment to the practice was less dependent on family transmission and more dependent on individuals, including non-Yoruba, who came to the practice independently. Among them were many who found in the religion answers to the numerous problems posed by life in the colonial society. All right. There is a list here that I'm going to speak on a little bit. All right. The places from which many came included West, Central Africa, and a few from East Africa. The compiled list of tribes were based on a census that was taken around that time. The first on the list is Senegambia, and they list the various tribes that would have came from that area. The tribes they have listed is the Malinke, the Wolof, and the Bambara. The other area listed is Upper Guinea, and the tribes listed would have been the Fulbe, the Susu, the Tem, and the Kisi. The other area mentioned is the Windward Coast, and two tribes are mentioned, the Kwaka and the Akwa. Okay, the Gold Coast, three tribes are mentioned, the Coromantine, the Fanti, and the Akan. And from the Bight of Benin, the tribes mentioned were the Hausas, the Alada, the Yoruba, and the Waida. The Bight of Biafra, the Igbo is listed. And from West Central Africa, the Bakongo. So all of these various tribes would have made up the population of Africans that existed in Trinidad. And as mentioned before, the name Sango would have been probably a familiar name to various Yoruba-speaking groups. So because of the popularity of Sango worship and the dominance of the population of migrants from Oyo, the influence of Sango would have greatly shaped the cultural practice of African traditional religion in Trinidad. Okay, all these other groups would have brought with them the various deities and the variations in different practices. But again, because of the dominance of the population that migrated from the Oyo area, you would have find that they would have dominated the practices and the structure of the religion. All right. The other point that I want to go into concerning the history of the Orisa practice in Trinidad is the influence that the Orisa cultural practices had on carnival. There are many cultural practices which can be traced back to Africa, some of which have evolved into indigenous forms, such as carnival, calypso, tambu bambu, and eventually the steel drum. The drum is the iconic African-derived musical instrument. The shapes and construction of drums, the way they are made, are West African in nature. Tambu bambu is derived from tambu, a Congolese word for drum. The bottle and spoon and steel percussions from cowbells, iron wheels, and steel drums produce tones that are basically West African. Stick fighting, or bois, is a dance-like martial arts with roots in the Congo and Angola. So these are all various things that the African or the Orisa influence has had on Trinidad's tradition. The stick fighting that they say came from the Congo and Angola is very much still practiced in places such as Maruga up till today. The term Kambole, because we may have heard of the Kambole riots. Kambole is actually a Congo word meaning parade or procession, usually accompanied by call and response, singing, and percussion. The idea of spirits being hidden behind masquerades, as well as having the body dabbed with paint and mud, is also African. All right. The source for this particular information would have been Dr. Maureen Warner Lewis. All right. In one of her books called Guinea's Other Son. All right. The African Dynamics in Trinidad Culture. All right. This book was printed in 215 by the University of the West Indies Press. So, I mean, if you're interested in getting more details concerning the influence that African, and namely specifically Orisa or Yoruba, influence on the various aspects of Trinidad Carnival and culture, you could look into that book called Guinea's Other Sons, right? Or the African Dynamics in Trinidad Culture. All right, I would continue on reading, and I'm going to go into further developments of various things such as calypso. I'm going to give you some of the history that I was able to get out of doing the research. On the contrary, though it may be for the intention of comedy and portraying Trinidad's mysticism and its associated stigma, a few calypsos may have incited further discrimination of African-based religiosity. Misha Lugon writes, in the past, there were negative ideas about the supernatural, which through an association with obeah and witchcraft was ridiculed in humorous calypsos. Slinger Francisco, known as the Mighty Sparrow, in his rendition Obeah Wedding in 1966, creates a plot of an adamant admirer of his pursuing to extreme measures to marry him, which included visiting an obeah man regularly to assist in achieving the client's desire. Caldwell Taylor indicates that this song brought negative attention to Papa Niza, who is Ebenezer Elliott. That's his correct name. That's the name we all know him as Papa Niza, but his name was a prominent Orisa leader at the time due to his name being mentioned, though boasted in song, further denigrating the function of Orisa leaders. The music industry serves as a counter-critique used as a medium to address and attack social ills. The calypso genre, or genre, rendered by various icons, have addressed the taboo of Orisa in their works in a time when this spiritism installed fear into citizens by a far greater extent than now. Singers such as Robert Nelson, known as Lord Nelson, Andre Tanker, David Rudder, Ella Andel, Hollis Liverpool, known as Chalkers, Michael Osuna, known as Sugar Aloes, and Sandra Mellington, known as Singing Sandra, has all paid homage to the Orisa in various calypsos, usually beginning with a chant and used as a chorus. These calypsos not only condemned and highlighted problems with we have the song that is